We are nearing the end of the 1960s decade in the series, so let's tie it up with not one, but 6 different projects all over the city in this one video. And let's start with building a new big hospital complex on the edges of the city. We will move right here to this empty area where there was just a small residential expansion with the experimental prefabricated blocks in the 1950s. Welcome everyone to the Altengrad city in City Skylines, and without further ado, let's build. So in this episode, we are going to focus entirely on building because we have a lot of things to build in front of us. So let's just explain the process and what kind of techniques I'm using in all these different things. So with the hospital build, it's going to be the largest project in today's episode, and I'm using exactly the same approach as I did, for example, with that university some time ago, 2 episodes back, I think. So I'm preparing a palette of the suitable buildings because there are no dedicated hospital buildings that I could use to put everything together. There are a few, but only single buildings like this one, for example, over here. That's actually a hospital in the workshop and in real life probably as well. But all the rest of the buildings are not. So I'm even using some residential buildings, some schools, I think, and some offices probably, and even a couple of industrial buildings for some maintenance structures or something like that. So we need to build some sort of a bigger hospital complex because it is going to be the largest hospital in the entire city, and the city, of course, needed that because the only hospital is the old one in the city center, or at least a bigger hospital. I'm thinking that throughout Altengrad there are various other clinics or something, but they don't really have dedicated buildings. They can be just about anywhere in any kind of structure in the first floor or something like that. So this is going to be the proper hospital. Now, there are a couple of hospitals that I looked at on Google Maps from this time period. There is a little bit of an inaccuracy in here, and I suppose that it's exactly the same as with the university. I'm not exactly sure if I mentioned it with the university project, but lots of these hospitals were super big, yeah, and they were not really constructed entirely in a single decade, in just a couple of years. So you could see, if you browse some of the old aerial views of cities, you can just see construction sites near these hospitals that remained construction sites for decades, 2 decades at least, right? Until the hospitals were entirely finished. And they were not even entirely finished anyway, because lots of these hospital complexes are just expanded further and further, even today, for example, adding helipads or other wings of the hospitals and, all kinds of structures. But I don't really want to revisit these projects because they are just kind of small. So it would be a little bit weird, clunky to just revisit all of these projects around the city in every single decade to just add a couple of buildings and maybe some few details. So it's probably best to just do it in one go. And yeah, sure, maybe we are going to revisit this hospital and the university, for example, or other places in the 2000s or even the 90s, and add just some, super modern elements to it that are really going to stand out and are going to tell us that, yeah, sure, the complexes did evolve over time. But right now, I'm just going to construct it how it probably would look in the 70s, 60s, these kinds of decades, when it was more or less complete, all right? So, this hospital complex, how exactly is it going to look? It's going to have this huge structure in the center, kind of facing the street. The entire hospital is a little bit oriented away from the main avenue. By the way, there is going to be the main avenue leading away from the city into a different district that we are going to add in the next decade. Right now, I'm just doing it partially. There is that bus stop right now on that street, but it's just a temporary solution since we don't really have all the rest of the places further from the city finished. So, that's just going to all change. For example, the main avenue, I had to slightly change it to make it kind of look good with the networks that it's connecting to. It's obviously connecting to that level crossing for the railways. That's also not particularly ideal. So, all of these things, yeah, sure, they are kind of weird, but we are going to, keep improving these infrastructure things when we expand the city. So as you can see, I'm using some really new buildings for this particular project. I'm not really recycling anything except these industrial buildings and that little chimney. I'm thinking that those are maybe like the heating plants for the, for the hospital complex. There's probably going to be some like hot water pipes running underground because, the hospital complex is fairly large, so why not do that? And maybe like a couple of garages or like maintenance garages for the ambulances, for example. Oh, by the way, I do have new ambulance vehicles from the workshop made by Meister Monis, and they're looking really good. So I'm going to place them right next to that like emergency entrance on the side of the complex, so that's going to look nice. But anyway, most of these buildings I downloaded from the workshop for the university or like more unique projects, let's say. But this is absolutely perfect. I believe that these buildings that are kind of looking like they are made from different kinds of structures, they are schools, elementary schools, I believe, and they fit perfectly. They have very similar style all together combined, and they just really look like the decade that we are in. So this is absolutely perfect. Of course, from the workshop, it's not exactly how I would like it, so I had to get rid of, well, for example, the surfaces below, and I oriented it a little bit differently than it's supposed to be, and just, created all these pedestrian connections. I, by the way, had huge problems with pedestrians in this project. I'm not even showing it in the time-lapse. I don't think I even recorded it because it was so frustrating. Basically, pedestrians would get stuck at the sidewalk of these roads and they don't want to just continue towards the building. So I believe that I had to get rid of some of these pedestrian paths because I really just had no patience dealing with the issues. There's just something wrong happening since the last City Skylines update. Pedestrians are getting more and more stuck in some places, don't really want to use the sidewalks as they used to. So this is just getting insanely frustrating. But yeah, with these kinds of custom projects, there are different possibilities how you can do things. So instead of trying to fix it, let's just do it differently and, be done with it really. So it's just working. Vehicles also are kind of strange for some reason. For example, the parking lots, the custom parking spaces that you download from the workshop are no longer working for me. Even in Asturias, the parking spots that I'm 100% sure they were working back in the day, but nowadays they don't, and I have to just use prop vehicles to fill parking lots. So on one hand, that's kind of better because, more customizability, I suppose. I can just put the exact vehicles that I want. Usually City Skylines parking lots are either completely full or completely empty, right? So if I want to kind of control the number of vehicles, I can just, I can just do it manually. Although with some bigger parking lots, I'm probably going to be talking about it later, it is a bit tedious, right? So anyway, so this is the parking lot. I used exactly the same technique to build it as with that bus station in that industrial zone in the previous episode, I believe. So curbless roads on the perimeter, basically, with only a single curb on the side, and then clipping networks in the center, plus covered it with ploppable asphalt. These huge parking lots, you really have to convert the ploppable asphalt into procedural objects and make sure that the render distance is set to some kind of crazy high number because the asphalt is going to disappear when you zoom out if it's going to remain a surface, remain a prop basically, and there's just going to be the void. And it's really noticeable with these kinds of large surfaces, especially parking lots. Obviously the prop cars are also going to disappear, so there's just going to be a big hole on the map and you will notice it right away. It's not that big of a deal for the bus terminals because the bus terminal is a little bit more filled with some kind of platforms or buildings, the station building, for example. So that's not that big of a deal, even though I still had to convert it into PO, but that's not really that much of a problem anyway. The entire hospital complex is just riddled with all of these connections, pedestrian paths everywhere. You can see that there are lots of pedestrians on the streets right now. That's because lots of these residential buildings that I used to create not only the main building, but also back here, these kinds of like more outside places, like long-term staying places. I'm not exactly sure how they would be called in English for the hospital places. Those are actual residential buildings in the game with lots of places to live. Yeah, so I had to tone it down with Rico. I had to really make sure that the hospital is not really going to be that crowded because it just looks a little too much. Also, those buildings that are actual schools, gameplay schools, I had to also change them. I think I changed them to like offices or something to really kind of tone it down. You can also see that traffic is very heavy in this area, so that also is not something I would like to see in this place. But as I was building it, it just remained the same. But I think that with the cinematics, I already applied some of the Rico settings, so it's going to be a little bit better. Overall, I'm kind of satisfied with the hospital projects. I really like how the buildings fit together, similar to, for example, that university build. So, that's nice. It really does look like some kind of 60s, 70s project. So, mission accomplished, I suppose, in that regard. Especially with these residential buildings that are forming that main building, the white buildings. Those are looking really good. Those are the French prefabricated buildings, by the way, but they just fit absolutely perfectly. I suppose that color-wise, the buildings don't exactly match, but it's okay. Now, we are going to move for the second project, and these projects are now going to be a little bit smaller in scale, but this one in particular is going to be still kind of nicely detailed, so, it's just going to look okay. We are very, very close to the hospital, the previous project. We are just, a couple of streets away, a couple of blocks away, basically below that train station, and this was the place in this block where there was this little like a chateau or like a palace building, and I decided that we are going to turn it to embassy, and not just any embassy, but the Soviet embassy. All right. So I was looking at various embassies in the capital cities around Central Europe, and I suppose that I took most inspiration from probably the Prague Soviet embassies, or these days Russian embassies, and also a little bit maybe the Warsaw embassy, and a couple of others. For example, the Berlin Soviet embassy is completely different. It's like a monumental building that's directly in the center of the city. This one is going to be a little bit more like the Warsaw embassy, which is basically just an old palace that got turned into an embassy. Similar situation is in Prague with the Russian embassies, although there are different buildings that belong to the embassy. It's not just one single complex of buildings, but it's like multiple places around the city. They are kind of fairly close, but it's like multiple complexes, yeah? And they do follow this somewhat similar style, where you have old structures that were constructed long before it turned into an actual embassy, and then you have some modern stuff right next to it, or in just like different places. But in this particular case, in Altengrad, I decided that we are going to have it in the single block. So that palace that was already there, that's just going to be like the ambassador's residence or something, the main office. And then we are also creating that new building, the one with the helipad. I think it's like a fire station or something, gameplay-wise, but I just turned it into procedural objects so that it fits the slope. It's not going to, mess with the terrain too much. And then later we are going to fill that roof with some kind of details so it doesn't look like that. And I'm thinking that it's probably some kind of like an embassy community center for the Soviet people or something like that. Or maybe like a cultural center, these kinds of things. And then we have those two smaller residential buildings. Again, those are the French prefabs. I'm intentionally doing that so that they look different from the prefabs that we will be using in the city. So it looks a tiny bit more like fancier, something like that. And those are just like residential buildings for all the embassy workers. I'm also creating these kinds of parking lots, and I'm later going to populate them with these kinds of limousines and these like very luxury cars. Yeah, for example, the Volga, the secret V8 Volga. I think you can download that from the workshop as well. At first, I was using just ordinary vehicles that I had in the city, but then I downloaded those special vehicles that I'm only going to be using as props. I'm not going to allow them to move around the city. Ordinary plebs obviously wouldn't have access to these kinds of cars. And of course, turning them all black. Now we are going to move for yet another project. Now we are in the city center, next to that big park, and in the old hospital complex. And in here, we are going to basically demolish a building block that's right next to it, and we are going to create like a modern new wing. Yeah, so like an expansion of the existing hospital. So I really do want to put some sort of modern buildings into Altengrad. I'm not necessarily saying that these are like nice changes to the city, skyline maybe, but well, they are going to be there. Yeah, there are going to be these modern structures popping up all around the city center, so that it's going to finally go into the more modern times, modern decades. And these things were done. City centers were changed with modern architecture, even with these kinds of changes, like demolishing old city blocks with buildings that were somewhat functioning still. So in here, I'm just using the buildings from the palette that I already prepared before. I believe that these particular buildings in the workshop are from some Chinese schools or something like that, but they just look perfect. Yeah, it's kind of like a generic structure, really. It doesn't really have a generic shape. It has a shape, especially when combined like that, to fit this block. That's very nice. But otherwise, it has these generic looking facade panels that are, seen in the 1960s on various buildings around the region. So this is absolutely perfect. And it's just a really, really small touch to this overall area, but it's a huge contrast now to that place, to all the super old buildings around it. Now, another project is going to take us to the remnants of the old city walls, as you can see. And here we are going to build the secret police headquarters. Okay, so this little block right on the edges of the old city walls, opposite the barracks, it used to be just some kind of warehouses, not exactly all that super important, just some first like one floor warehouses, very low density industry, I suppose. We now have the industry concentrated mostly to that big industrial areas around the city, so that in that huge one, in that new district, as well as the harbor, which is kind of nearby. So these kinds of buildings in the city center are no longer necessary. And this was a perfect spot for some kind of a project like this. At first, I wanted to build like a embassy building in here, but I did not really find suitable buildings. And I finally decided that we are going to do the embassy, well, like we did it in that chateau area. That kind of felt more fitting for Altengrad. And this place is going to be reserved for the secret police headquarters. So I'm using this building, again, kind of perfect architectural wise. It has those facade panels as well, even though the building might look a little bit like 70s, not particularly 60s, but we are at the end of 1960s anyway, so I suppose that it's going to be fine. It has this very typical like sculptural looking entrance, I suppose. This is a building from real life, from Berlin. I'm not exactly sure about that though, but it's just perfect. It's just perfect. The facade, the entrance, the scale of it as well is just perfect. So nothing all that extraordinary over here. We are just going to put some kind of a parking lot in front of it. That's kind of like a reoccurring theme in these projects, building parking lots to, emphasize the change in times, in technology, in just adding more cars, and then just detail it, make all the edges of these places look good, all the surfaces, put some planters in here, plant some trees, and just, tie it all up. The building was a tiny little bit boring, so I decided to just, with procedural objects, create this little extension at the back. The back would otherwise be completely empty. I'm later going to only put some sort of like warehouses in there, which is probably some sort of garages, I suppose, for the headquarters. And this is just like a little extension. Also, it's a perfect place for this building because it's enclosed, obviously, by the walls. So, all the people from the back of the building cannot really escape if they end up inside. Well, you don't really want to end up inside these kinds of buildings in these time periods, that's for sure. Doing these kinds of changes to buildings with procedural objects always distorts the roof, which means that it's a better thing to do to just cover it with something. We are in the city center, which means I'm still using cobblestone on the surface, so I cannot use the usual technique, and that is using asphalt, yeah? I did that with the new hospital because that's a new place. I can change the texture, but in here that would be just way too weird. So I'm using those, I believe, Ronix's roof networks and cover the roofs with them. I have node controllers, so I can, perfectly fit them on all the roofs, and well, it's looking fine. Couple of flags at the entrance, and that's it. Next project is going to be the change of the exhibition center. The exhibition center remained exactly the same from the 20s or 30s when we first built it, and it really does require some kind of, touches, right? So, first thing that we are going to do, again, like a reoccurring theme in these projects, we're going to build a huge parking lot. We are going to cut down the trees on the sides of the exhibition center and going to push the empty area inside the exhibition center a little bit inside so that it makes more space around here. So this is a perfect spot for a parking lot like this. It's right next to this main avenue leading into the city, main street going from the edges of the map as well. So this kind of exhibition center would obviously not serve just the citizens of Altengrad, but also, people from different cities and even different countries. If there was like an important exhibition going on, they could just arrive into this place. I was kind of partially inspired by the Erfurt IGA place. I'm not really sure exactly how it's called, but it's basically like a gardening expo built, or, well, the place was built or changed in different decades. But when I was looking at some aerial views of it, it also had this huge parking lot. I believe in 1970 was the picture that I saw exactly. And that exactly inspired me to build a parking lot right here. And this is just a huge change that will contrast with the old structures of the exhibition center very well. Yeah, especially the entrance. Like suddenly there is a parking lot that just screams, modern times, as opposed to the architecture of the entrance. So, it's not particularly nice change. Obviously, it's just a big, place with asphalt, nothing else, and cars. But, well, that's how things were back in the day, and that's how they still are today, of course. Now, we're also going to do something with the buildings inside. I decided that we are going to get rid of one wing of those old buildings. Perhaps they were not demolished intentionally. Perhaps they were just, destroyed by fire or something like that, and something new needed to be built in its place. This super green building, that's some kind of a swimming pool, I believe, or some sports area, but it kind of fits this place very nicely. And this second building that I'm putting this mosaic on, that's a concert hall, I think, in real life. But again, it just looks perfect for these kinds of purposes and these kinds of time periods as well. There were also these connecting bridges. Now, I ended up with this open area in the center, so what to do with it? And since we are at the end of the 60s, I decided that we are going to turn it into a car exhibition, and we are basically going to introduce all the new vehicles for the 1970s, all right? So I have a new bus model, we have a couple of vans, and we have mostly these personal vehicles. So in here I'm kind of presenting the Škoda 105 for the 70s. Obviously, most of these vehicles were not like presented all at once in real life. Some of them appeared in the beginning of 70s, some of them towards the end. But, in here I'm just, taking some artistic liberty, I suppose, and placing them all at once. This little corner is going to be reserved for the Soviet vehicles and the famous Zhiguli vehicle. Yeah, so a couple of them over there, different versions, and some vans on the other side, I believe, as well. Oh yeah, and I'm going to place these awnings over here because it's like a, kind of a big event. So there's going to be all these stalls with some kind of information about these vehicles and all the different things. And most importantly, I'm just going to put lots of event generators. You will see in the cinematics how it's going to be very crowded. The last project for today is going to be very, very, very far from the city, and it's going to be like a secret retreat for the Communist Party officials. These places were built in the 1960s in real life as well. There's, for example, one in Germany, which was built following some of the public unrest to serve as not only like a recreational area, but also as possible retreat for the party officials if things didn't go exactly as planned. But there is also a place in Czechoslovakia which was built on the side of a reservoir of a big dam that I actually showed in the previous video, the Orlik Dam, and it looked very much like this. So it was just a very secret area that no one knew about really until the 1990s, and it just had these kinds of super low density houses very far away from each other with like a central hotel area. It was mostly used for some kind of foreign visits, for example, from the Soviet Union and these kinds of places. So that's just a little small project on the very outskirts of the city, and it's just adding something on the edges, so that's fine. I eventually decided that I'm not going to do what I said in that university episode, and that was adding lots of the low-density areas around the city. I know that I said that I would like to make it look similar to, for example, Budapest, but Budapest in this way is actually kind of unique. You don't really see the low-density areas that much. You probably see them a bit more than what we have in Altengrad, but to be honest, guys, I just cannot help it. It's really super boring to build the low-density places. When I just clicked on the low-density houses, I immediately remembered all the pain that I had to go through when I built some of them in the 30s. So I just decided, no, that's not going to work. We are not going to build that. And Altengrad is just going to remain as it is with these more high-density projects. And it's kind of okay because for the things that I would like to showcase in the city, for the kind of history that I would like to talk about in the series, this is perfectly adequate. Yeah, we don't really need those high-density areas. It would be just something in the background which is like okay, but it's just so boring to build it, sorry. So it is what it is. It's going to remain like that. Alright, so those were the cinematics, those were the transitions for the hospital. So, the transition didn't really show much because it was just a project built on completely open ground, but these kinds of transitions are going to be a little bit more interesting because they will show us the transitions between some existing stuff and the new stuff. So this is, for example, a huge change, even though not like big in scale, but the skyline of the city from this view, I suppose, is going to be different. The new hospital wing is very tall, taller than all of these buildings around it. Obviously not tall than some of the skyscrapers that we did already, but still quite significant. And it looks completely different, especially compared to those longer, hospital buildings that we have in this area. This is actually also kind of a tall building, although not super tall like the previous ones, but it is nevertheless a modern change in this entire area. But, smaller, but still kind of significant. So also with all of these modern details all around it. So that was kind of a welcome change in this place. Why not? The next project is, of course, the exhibition center change, and that one is a bit more significant because the building change is really noticeable. Yeah, we got rid of those old wings, like I mentioned, and also the parking lot just completely changed the view from the river direction from that modern intersection. So it's basically like another project that really modernized, for the better, for the worse. That depends on your kind of view. I'm just, building it as it probably might have been back in the days. But anyway, that is going to be all for Altengrad in the 1960s. I am going to build one more, well, not build, I'm just going to record one more episode. It's going to be cinematics only. It's going to showcase all the changes that happened after the war. And I would like to also combine it with some kind of introduction to the 1970s. Alright, so that's going to be all for today. Thank you for watching. If you like this episode, then please do all the things as usual. And big thanks to all the channel members that we currently have. I really appreciate all your support, guys. Thank you so much. Take care. Goodbye.